We are now live.
Thank you, Christine. Oh, Tata.
Cool.
Hold on, folks. I'm having some technical difficulties having us go live on Facebook, so I'm going to have to stop sharing here for a second.
Might want to talk to locals.
All right, well, we'll get started and then I will bring this over into Facebook. But we'd like to welcome everybody to our January 2nd Saturday. Those joining us, well, everybody's online. So for some announcements, we'll be going over some upcoming events and then I will introduce our speakers. On Wednesday, January 20th, Scott Mingus and James McClure will present Civil War stories from York County, PA. This is part of our Civil War Roundtable and will be held virtually. On January 21st, Ophelia Chambliss, community historian, will present Share Your History, a virtual program about the importance of saving African-American history, including new research and a preview of her summer Juneteenth exhibit, which will be at the York County History Center. This will also be a virtual program. And actually, I think it's safe to say that all of the programs that I'm about to announce are virtual programs. Saturday, January 23rd is our virtual family day. The theme is Who is Your Hero? So this is for children and families to help them learn about our local and regional history together and take a look at heroes all around us and the helpers that enrich our community and keep us safe, clean, and happy. So that will be several events throughout the day, several brief events throughout the day, including hands-on activities that you can do at home with your families. February 23rd, there are programs in between January 23rd and February 23rd, but this is a new sort of experimental program, and it's our virtual 18th century cooking demonstration. This will be done via a Zoom meeting so that we can have a little bit more interaction with you while we cook and prepare 18th century and early 19th century recipes. On February 13th, Scott Mingus will be discussing, well, that'll be our second Saturday. He'll be discussing the Civil War and its effect on regional railroad systems. If you are joining us via Zoom, you can type your questions into the Q&A or the chat boxes at the bottom. So if you scroll your mouse over your screen, a menu at the bottom should pop up with a little speech bubble or two speech bubbles, chat and Q&A, and you can type questions and comments into those. And I'll make sure that our speakers answer those questions for you. And now I'm going to introduce our speakers. Ivette Guzmán Zavala is a PhD and LVC professor of Spanish and has a BA from the University of Puerto Rico, a master's from the Syracuse University, and her PhD from Rutgers University. Dr. John Hinshaw, PhD, is an LVC professor of history, received his bachelor's at McAllister,
Alistair.
yes, University, McAllister College, and a master's and PhD from Carnegie Mellon University. Dr. Guzmán Zavala is from Caguas, Puerto Rico. She is a graduate of the University of Puerto Rico, trained in art education and Caribbean literature. She's published several articles on the literary, artistic, and photographic perceptions of mothers and women in Puerto Rican history. Her training from Syracuse and Rutgers University led her to analyze the role of migration and the diaspora in Puerto Rican history. Her experiences in Pennsylvania helped her to understand the human dimension of displacement. Dr. John Hinshaw is from Columbia, Missouri. He has written or co-written 3 books on industrial and labor history in the US and world history. Hinshaw published an article in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography in 2016. Doctors Guzmán Zavala and Hinshaw met at Lebanon Valley College, and they started working on oral interviews independently for their courses in Spanish and history, respectively, long before the idea for Dutchirican came along. They noticed a gap between LVC and the mostly Hispanic Lebanon community, and interviews were a way for students to practice the language and get to know the community. People told students stories of migration, personal sacrifice, community formation, and experiences of racism. And so I am going to turn the time over to Dr. Hinshaw and Dr. Guzmán Zavala, and I'm going to fix the problem over at Facebook.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's our pleasure to be here. So this is a joint collaboration, and even though I'm going to be doing most of the speaking, many of you are probably wondering what Dutchirican means or who Dutchiricans are. And it's a term, as you well know, that this is the Pennsylvania Dutch countryside. And there are, for people who are Puerto Rican and either live or are born in other parts of the United States, people who are in New York are often called Nuyorican. Sometimes people in New Jersey are called Jersey Ricans. And there were, in our research, we started to find the connections between these kind of archetypical Pennsylvania Dutch, which would be Mennonites, Anabaptists who've been here for 250 years, and Puerto Ricans, some of whom are Mennonites as well, or have a very close connection with the church or with that religious tradition. And so we thought it was interesting. And some of the people said, yeah, we're Dutchiricans, or they called their kids Dutchiricans. And so we use that as a way to kind of mix up the narrative that Puerto Ricans are from the outside and the Pennsylvania Dutch are here. And it's just to talk about the changes in the region. Okay, so let me just see this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through some, let me see here. Sorry, I just have to figure out how to get this. The way I know how to do this is to, okay. I'm going to talk about some demographics first. I'm going to pause if there's questions or comments, then we'll take that there. And then otherwise, then I'll go in and I have a little prepared talk and some images from the, from the posters that we did and some exhibits. So part of what this first slide basically shows you, sorry, let me see if I can get my photograph out of the way, my image out of the way, is this was from an ABC News outlet just the other day, and I thought it's a very good demonstration that our part of the state is growing. The state as a whole is growing, but not relative to the United States as a whole, which is why we're going to lose a congressional seat, or we're likely to lose one seat in the next reapportionment of Congress. So, but as you can see, in Lebanon and in York, the vast majority of population growth is due to Hispanics coming in. And so part of what, and as we'll talk about later, about half or a little more than half of that is are Puerto Ricans. And then the next biggest group would be Dominicans and people from Mexico, Central America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So part of what I'm just trying to say is just to understand the changes in the population, the demographics of Central PA means to kind of come to grips with Latinos. If you look before 1940, there were some Latinos or people with Spanish surnamed. It's always a little, there's sometimes the census doesn't count. People from different places before 1940, you could look at like specifically countries that they were from. But what you basically see is that before about 1970, we're talking about very small numbers as a whole. So as of 2010, it's about 5.7%, but you'll notice that almost all of this population growth occurs after 1970, and it's mostly when the state as a whole is deindustrializing, which is interesting and important. This is just a way of showing where Puerto Ricans live, and enormous amounts of that population growth in the last 20 years is coming out from New York City. So places like York, and I highlighted kind of badly, it's not a great image, but you see the yellow image down here, the little yellow mark. York County is basically on the western edge of this outward migration from New York City or the New York metro area. And that's because, for a variety of reasons, New York City is pretty expensive to live. It's gotten more and more expensive to live over the last 20 years. Wages and salaries in New York City, I find it always amazing that they're really no higher than they are in Pennsylvania. In fact, they're a little bit higher here. And your dollar goes further for things like rent in central Pennsylvania than it does in New York City. And so to some extent, what you're seeing is just this basically reallocation of population out of New York City, or of Puerto Ricans and others from New York City, as the city becomes unaffordable for people, for working people, middle-class people. So this is a table from my paper, and part of what I'm trying to show here is that in 1970, 70%, the vast majority of Puerto Ricans or Latinos in Pennsylvania lived in Philadelphia or the ring counties around Philadelphia. There was a small number of Puerto Ricans and others who lived in central Pennsylvania. But what you've seen more recently is that the population growth is really occurring outside of Philadelphia. So people who are coming from New York City, some are going to Philly, but most who are coming from from New York City are coming to towns like Lebanon, Lancaster, York, Allentown, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you start to see places like in the anthracite region where they're coming in. And as I talked about before, what you see, again, this is also from my article, that you have very, very low levels of home ownership in the Bronx. If you look at San Juan, people own homes at about the same rate that they do in the United States as a whole. If you look at Puerto Ricans or Latinos in Lancaster, Lehigh County, it's not that their home ownership rates match that of people in the area, but it's multiples higher than it is in New York City. So again, housing is a major reason why people are moving to Pennsylvania. And then one last thing, I think this is the last demographic slide that I have, is I looked at obituaries, and I'm kind of interested in how obituaries give you a kind of interesting data source at a point where for Puerto Ricans and other Latinos, there's really not much archival resources that are available in South Central PA. But what you can get at least some information from obituaries. And so I looked at obituaries of people who were born in Puerto Rico and died in either Allentown or Lancaster. And they, so there's 400 or so in Allentown and maybe 250 in Lancaster. Of those who mentioned that they had a church affiliation, and many didn't, right? Obituaries are a funny source, right? The family puts the information in. It's always also determined by what's important to the person and how much money they have. So it's not at all a perfect source, but what I'll point to is just the idea that in a very Catholic county, like in the area around Allentown, there's a lot of Catholic Puerto Ricans. In Lancaster, which is a much more Protestant or at least non-Catholic area, you have a lot of non-Catholics. And that's part of what led us to look at Mennonites, because some of these people were in Mennonite churches, and that just seems so surprising to me. Not to Ivette, that's very typical, and there's lots of churches in Puerto Rico, and they're just part of the landscape. But to me, I thought, oh, that's a really curious thing, and it kind of pointed to trying to understand the connections between, like, how did that happen? So, okay. So Christine, are there any questions, or can I just kind of rattle on?
Not so far. Keep on.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and just talk. Let me see. Okay. So I hit the stop sharing, and I have a little, okay. So in some ways, what I'm interested in is the question of immigration or migration, perhaps better thought of, because people from Puerto Rico are US citizens. It's a complicated question. They could be seen as another nation. They sometimes see themselves as another nation, but immigration defines Pennsylvania's history. And it has, for the United States as a whole, lots and lots of whole, shelves of books are filled with the immigrant experience. And for most historians, the story about immigration goes like this. European immigrants were attracted to come to Pennsylvania or to the US by the rise of factories, coal mining railroads. Europeans lived in cities, coal patches, small industrial towns. Their children became kind of ethnic Americans, so hyphenated Americans. And then as time goes on, the ethnic identity kind of fades and people just become American, but they might have some roots in that immigrant experience. So this kind of narrative, the combination of industrialization, urbanization, and immigration is kind of set, right? And if you look at Black history, and that's part of really how I was trained at Carnegie Mellon, Black migration to the Commonwealth can be fit into this urban industrial nexus because the vast majority of African Americans who came to the Commonwealth came before about 1931, when factories and cities were really growing. Now, after the 1930s, you have a really different story, really after World War II. This is where cities and industries aren't growing, they're declining. And immigration, certainly from Europe, had stopped by about 1924 because of restrictive immigration laws. After about 1931, immigration from the Deep South basically stopped because of the Depression. There's a little bit of pickup in World War II, but by and large, immigrants from the South, or migrants from the South, largely bypassed Pennsylvania. So the post-war period sees the topic of immigration to the state basically disappear. And it's not happening, so you don't really see a lot of books about immigration written about the post-war period. What you start to see is not immigration, but ethnic identity, and then not urbanization, but urban decline, or suburbanization, or ghettoization. So Blacks are left in ghettos in the city. The factories basically are declining, or rapidly or slowly, depending on which industry you're talking about. And so that's kind of, in some ways, like Philadelphia kind of fits into that, because you have essentially a ghettoized Puerto Rican community that gets fit into that, even though they sort of show up at the point where industrialization is really kind of declining. So that's the narrative structure, and that works. It's not untrue, it's true. But you can't really make that structure work for what happens after 1960 or Latino migration today. So part of what you see is that even though Latinos are the most important part of the population growth of the state, there's really not much scholarly attention to it. So part of that, what you see is that there's, in some ways, it's just that urbanization and industrialization narrative doesn't really work at all. Like there's maybe one or two places where, like in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, there were a few hundred Puerto Ricans who were hired by Beth Steel at the height of World War II, and they built a little enclave in the city, and that's mainly it. You could kind of argue that some of the Philadelphia groups are brought in, but the reason I'm saying it doesn't really work is like if in Philadelphia, you're talking about people who were recruited to come to the United States to work in agriculture. And that certainly, I don't know much about agriculture, but it's not factories. I mean, so people, a lot of the immigrants or migrants in Philadelphia who are Puerto Rican, they worked on truck farms out in the Philadelphia area and then came back to live in the city. And so people worked in agriculture and then they later shifted into either food processing like at Campbell's Soup, or equally likely into the service sector, hotels, restaurants, and sort of everywhere where the working poor can get jobs. So, but this kind of really large scale migration that happens in the last 20 years is pretty different. And it's different in a number of ways. As I mentioned before, people are largely moving to deindustrialized towns, which doesn't make it at all sense if you're looking at urbanization and industrialization. Second, there's not really been an explosion of warehousing and factory jobs. I mean, there's been some growth. Now, it's also true that to the extent that there is, it's not that there's an explosion of jobs, but these are basically pretty hard jobs that Puerto Ricans and other Hispanics are overrepresented in, because most people who have a choice of jobs don't want to work in a poultry processing plant. It's just too hard. And then third, the reason that people are moving here isn't so much because the economy is booming, it's just because housing is cheaper. Or they say the schools are good, or they say I have family in the area, or the healthcare facilities are better and we're having trouble getting treatment either in New York City or in the Caribbean. And then fourth, you start to see people coming into the area, certainly after Hurricane Maria, who are coming not because there's an explosion of jobs here, it's just that there's a kind of series of climactic crises at home, and that's pushing people out. So all of that, all of those events don't really fit into that model. In some ways, I'm saying that model works well enough before 1945, but it doesn't really explain what's going on now. And a lot of those scholarship, to the extent that it's being done, is being done by sociologists, it's being done by geographers or other kind of people. And part of that's because there's not much done on South Central PA, in part because we don't have a Ph.D. granting institutions. There's lots of research being done, or some research being done in Philadelphia, almost none in Pittsburgh, because there's no real, Pittsburgh's still declining, even though its economy is stable, the population is getting lower and lower in that region as a whole. So migrants don't go to places where the economy is in decline. So let me just so part of what I'm just trying to say is that scholarly confusion is matched and maybe even reflects a kind of popular confusion where people just kind of don't really understand why Latinos, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans are coming here. And in some cases, you see people getting mad because the way they think of this town is the town used to be nice, and now it's becoming run down because of the presence of Puerto Ricans. And I would say like Hazleton is a good example of that, where when Lou Barletta was mayor of the town, he recruited Dominicans to come to the town because they would basically make the population grow. They were available to work in factories. And then once they were there, there was a kind of backlash against it, which Lou Barletta kind of encouraged, led, and then he was able to ride that into Congress, although not any further than that. So there's a kind of confusion and tension. And I would say that often what happens is people are more confused and more angrier about change before it happens than when it happens. And I would say, like, I would use myself as an example as a kid. You know, if you're talking about something like food, if somebody had said, oh, you're gonna have to eat tamales, I'd be like, I don't like tamales. Well, I've never had a tamale. I don't know what it, all I know is it's not something I've ever had. I'd say, I like my mashed potatoes and I like my meatloaf because I'm a good Midwestern boy. And then when I tried tamales, I'm like, ooh, they actually kind of taste like meatloaf and mashed potatoes all together.
Can I
So-
have more?
Yeah, can I have more? Yeah, it's the same. It's when I get together with my brothers, we all like tamales because it's different, but it's very familiar in some other ways. So part of what we're trying to do with this is to talk about Hispanics or Latinos in the state and kind of change the narrative to do it in a variety of ways. And so let me go back and talk about some of the posters. Boom. Okay. So part of what we did with the exhibit is we went back to that very, very early period where there were just a few hundred people who spoke Spanish in the state. And we looked at people like Francisco de Miranda. De Miranda basically helped fight in the American Revolution to liberate the United States from the English Empire. He also tried to do the same in his adopted country, which is then called Gran Colombia. Now he's sort of adopted as a Venezuelan, not George Washington, but a kind of John the Baptist, somebody who kind of tried to was a precursor to later successful efforts. And what's interesting about De Miranda is, so he's there, he kind of leads this revolt. And also what's interesting is there's statues of him in Philadelphia, Venezuela, and also in San Juan, Puerto Rico, because that's where he was held briefly before he was sent back to die in jail in Spain when he was arrested by the colonial authorities. So we also, we also looked at, there's another poster of Manuel de Trujillo y Torres, and he was a contemporary of de Miranda, and he was a writer and somebody who encouraged the trade and commerce between the Caribbean when it was mostly a possession of Spain and places like Philadelphia. And it's Philadelphia at that time period is really interesting because we're the capital of the first republic or the largest republic in a long time. There's a lot of weapons kicking around the country because we just fought a war. And so people like De Miranda and Trujillo y Torres are sometimes in the weapons business trying to get weapons to revolutionaries and in other parts of the world. Torres writes books, and one of them is about if you are trying to export, say, or import 100 gallons of rum, how do they measure 100 gallons? It's not the same measurement necessarily that they use in Puerto Rico as they use in here. And what's the currency there? And what are the exchange rates? And all of the different states have different currencies, and all of the different colonies use different currencies. Sometimes they use Mexican pesos. So some ways his book was just like a testament to why the metric system made sense, because there was so much arbitrary definitions of everything from measurements to of money to weights to volume, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We also looked at Henry Pleasants and John Ortega. These are two individuals. Ortega won the Medal of Honor for his efforts on the USS Pennsylvania. Pleasants was the Argentine-born engineer who led the Schuylkill County miners who tunneled under Confederate forces at the Battle of the Crater. And so Pleasants basically did his part right, and then the Union general basically screwed it up. But in some ways, what we're just saying is, it's a kind of just a way to say, since the Republic was founded, Spanish-speaking people were here. They contributed. They were part of the state's history. They weren't a large part of the history, but they're not unimportant. We also looked at the contributions of tomateros, and this was the period between really the late 1940s and mid 1960s when a lot of Puerto Ricans came to the Commonwealth to work for 2 to 3 months out of a year. And this was when you had a lot of people in Puerto Rico who were really, really poor. I mean, really poor. And a lot of them worked in the sugarcane season, and the kind of dead period of the sugarcane season actually coincided with the tomato season in this part of the world. And so they would come up and work for a while and try to make as much money as they can and then go back home. And so this is a picture of, I want to say, the Hess family, who's a Mennonite family from Lancaster County, who were basically giving water to the tomateros. And it sounds, so this is this period where farmers were able to make a fair amount of money, or at least some money, selling tomatoes to the canning market, but they needed people who were really, really highly skilled, because you had to pick the tomatoes when they were green and therefore hard, but ripe or would ripen. And so the farmers were paid on a piecework basis by the canning companies. And so the tomateros were also paid on a piecework basis. So it was an interesting kind of relationship. And I know from looking at newspaper accounts at the time that farmers loved Puerto Ricans, because these guys were adults. They'd worked in agriculture their whole lives. They knew how to work. And they worked really, really hard because they were only here for a short period of time. But where they were going to live, yeah, much dicier question. Everybody wanted the labor, but nobody wanted them to work. And so people were put in really ad hoc housing. And so this is an example, what we try to reproduce with our exhibit. So a lot of times people were basically put up in sheds behind farmers' houses. And this is a reproduction of a chicken shed that one of the people we interviewed, her father lived in this shed. And so what we're trying to kind of get at is how, is in part that kind of statement behind, which says on the left, remembering Pedro Ventura, 1955. And then on the right in Spanish, it says, this is my cave, 1955. So I'm guessing that one of the things the guy was doing was painting a barn, or they had painted the barn, because it looks like barn paint to me. So we're just trying to kind of take that cryptic notion, which is just like a piece of graffiti, and really kind of explicate it and show, again, that Puerto Ricans were central to the economy, but they're not really showing up in historical accounts. So my wife, who's an artist, I did the carpentry on this, so I'm kind of proud of that. Not that it's great carpentry, but it, had to try to make it look like it was aged wood. And my wife did the drawing, so that's pretty capable. And then the last thing I'll leave you with is the case of Vicky Martinez. Again, this is another poster that we did. And this, I think, is such an amazing story, and it kind of points to kind of how we're trying to, kind of how and why we think this exhibit is important. So Vicky Martinez is a young girl who comes to a Mennonite farm in South Central Pennsylvania as part of the Fresh Air program. And so the Fresh Air program, as some of you may know, was this, and goes back 100 years, we're going to take kids from the city who are living in slums or who are living in, and give their parents a break and expose them to the fresh air and wholesomeness of the countryside. And Vicky Martinez shows up as one of hundreds, thousands of these kids. There's a couple of books about this, one of which is really, really good about the whole process in Juniata County. But Vicky Martinez shows up, and she's not a victim. She's like this way that Puerto Ricans show up and build these relationships. But for the Mennonite girl who's like her older sister, she looks at Vicky Martinez, and it's clear, she looks at Vicky Martinez with awe. The fresh air is not blowing into Vicky Martinez's lungs, it's flowing into Miss Showalter's lungs. because she says, this girl shows up and her bag, her clothes were always so stylish. She was able to wear things that were in the fashion. She didn't have to wear plain clothes. When you opened her suitcase, all of the clothes were neatly folded by her mom. The suitcase smelled like these very exotic scents like cilantro and coriander. And so, and she remembers Vicky Martinez with such fondness that she's somebody, as she says, she was a breath of fresh air. She opened the world to me. So of course I remember this person. And the kind of in part, I was really struck by this story because I had read something in the process of doing this research about migration of Mexican nationals to the Great Plains in the last 15, 20 years. And this is a part of the country, the Western Kansas or Nebraska, where the area has been in population decline for more than 100 years, right? It's just, certainly since the mechanization of agriculture, it's not a place where people, by and large, tend to want to go. And the city fathers and mothers have been trying everything they know how to do to get people to move there. If you were willing to move there, Christine, they'd give you a house, they'd give you a house. They'd say, you don't have to pay taxes on your house for the next 10 years, things like that. Anything they can do, particularly to get young people to come. And so what started to happen is Mexican nationals, sort of like what happened in South Central PA, Mexican nationals came into the area and they didn't want to live in Denver. They didn't want to live in Chicago or Houston or Dallas. They wanted to live in the country. They were coming straight from the country, and if given a choice, they decided they'd rather live in the country and work in slaughterhouses or work on farms or do whatever. And initially, there was a lot of resistance and a lot of stuff. And I would say that's kind of where we are in South Central PA. And over time, what ends up happening is what happens with most immigrant groups is people get married, people have kids, somebody who's really hostile to Mexicans in general wants to see their grandkids. They want to go cheer their grandkids play basketball at the court. And the story that kind of stuck with me from that New York Times article was, in this one little town, there's only one cafe, right? These are small towns. And that cafe has decided they will have international food one night a week. And on that night, they serve meatloaf and macaroni and cheese and mashed potatoes. And the rest of the time, it's tamales and enchiladas and all of that. So it's just a way of saying that I think is, as the perspective of a historian, what we're going through now is kind of that early stage. And I think as time goes on, we're going to discover things that, we're going to forget this period of time and kind of say, oh yeah, this has always been, of course, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans and Mexicans are part of the fabric of Central PA. They've always have been here. So let me see again. Christine, do we have any questions? Are we good?
Well, just one. So I wanted to return to a point that you made, we were talking about earlier, about sort of the, people assuming that the decline of their city is because of the Latinx populations that are moving in. So do you think that they're often used as scapegoats for cities that are declining in other ways? Sure.
I guess what I would say, the events of this week and maybe the last few years have shown us that people it's important how people feel about things rather than what's actually happened. Like no one really says, when did the industry decline? When did the average income of this area decline? No, they just go with what most people just go with. It used to be a nice place when I was a kid. That's how I remember it. And it's not a nice place now. And so I'm going to basically, decide that this group might have caused the other thing, which doesn't make any logical sense, but it makes great emotional sense. Mm-hmm. And things don't have to make logical, empirical sense, except if you're a social scientist or a historian. But most of us don't have to do that. So in part, we're just trying to say, we're trying to kind of change the narrative a little bit to say, how can people be destroying things if they help fight a war to win the republic, to defend the war? to defend the Republic against the Confederacy, to kind of build the economy, yada, yada, yada. So.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. And I think that's it.
Okay, so I think we have enough time to show a little video. It's about 14 minutes long. It will kind of walk you through the exhibit, and you'll see all the great work that my wife did, as well as us in terms of that. So Christine, take it away.
Can I come here? Okay.
If you have trouble, I can play it on my end and then just share a screen.
Okay.
And this is
Here it is.
from at Street Road Artist Space, which is in Chester County, they were really, really a wonderful partner for us.
There we go.
Hi, everybody. This is John Hinshaw, and I'd like to welcome you to Dutchirican. The image you see here is of Ramonita Santiago, who's a really important character in this story, and she was raised for part of her life behind the Weber family, who you see standing next to one of the Weber daughters, and she was raised in a small converted chicken house, nicer than this one, clearly. But housing and that kind of hybridity between what we used to think of as Pennsylvania Dutch, or we used to think of as Puerto Rican, is an important part of the story. I'm a historian, so a lot of the history is front-loaded into this exhibit. So you see, in this image, you see the Dutchirican. These are the Puerto Rican tomateros, the guys who pick the tomatoes, who are an important part of the story. They also lived in houses very much like this one, and they were pivotal because that is an early way that a lot of Puerto Ricans came to rule central Pennsylvania. They came to pick tomatoes as a seasonal crop. It actually fit nicely with the downtime in the sugar industry, which was dominant in Puerto Rico in the 1940s. So when the sugar, in the dead zone of sugar, men would fly to the US and then pick tomatoes, and this is a scene of that. And that's part of this larger transition that historians talk about of industrialization or field to factory. Housing is an important theme of the exhibit, and here you see an external shot of a chicken shed of the kind that you would have seen from the interior shot before. The relationship between tomateros and farmers was a bit like sharecropping. It's in one level, it's a fair trade. On the other hand, it's really unequal. The guys who are working want to make money, and the farmers have jobs for them to do. So in that sense, it really works out. On the other hand, as the phrase, "this is my cave," suggests, the physical environment as well as the work is a reminder that workers don't have dignity. And so the exhibit on the inside shows both the examples of hard work and the efforts to maintain a sense of dignity by having symbols of their manhood or symbols of their nationality. So we put Rita Moreno, who at that time was an artist kind of breaking onto the scene, the first Puerto Rican star of screen and stage. The Street Road colleagues did such an amazing job in terms of organizing the space. It's such a shame you can't be there in person. So we designed a number of posters to show the rootedness of Latinx people in this part of the world. The first poster you see is Francisco de Miranda, who's one of the founding fathers of Venezuela, but also was an important figure in the American Revolutionary War. To the right, you see John Ortega, who was one of the first was the first Hispanic recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is our highest military honor. So I think it's important to remember that while there weren't large numbers of Latinx people in the American Revolution or at that time, there were some, and they were contributing to the creation of the American Republic, defending it in times of extreme danger, and were part and parcel of making Pennsylvania what it is today. Trujillo y Torres was an author in post-revolutionary Philadelphia, and he encouraged greater trade and commerce between Pennsylvania and the Caribbean. There are a lot more Latinx people in Pennsylvania now in the last 20, 25 years, and that's almost entirely due, as you can see in the image, from people moving out from New York City because of the lack of affordable housing.
This is Ivette Guzmán Zavala. When those tomato pickers or tomateros came to the United States, they not always traveled alone, and women became important agents for maintaining cultural and social traditions and establishing new ones. One example is the Ramonita Santiago's family story as told by Shirley Ball in At Every Gate Apparel from 1986. And another example is Grandma Ortega, a Mexican woman who provided one of the first meeting houses for the Latino Mennonites in Central PA. Another venue for personal interaction happened through the Fresh Air program. Elaine Showalter, a Mennonite woman that participated in the program, describes the girl, Vicky Martinez, as a breath of fresh air that saves and brings new life to her own. This description reverses the traditional expectation that the Puerto Rican child needed to learn from the woman. And instead, the child teaches the woman about family, cultural values, and love. This exhibition includes some photographs that I took of the Latinx community, and in many instances, the contributions of women are evident. You probably noticed that our approach combines academic research in the humanities and also oral histories of people in the community. This brings me to the celebration of Our Lady of Guadalupe. The Mexican celebration of La Guadalupe brings many Latinos to St. Benedict the Abbot Catholic Church in Lebanon, PA, to celebrate with music, dance, and a reenactment of the saint's miracle. Malinali is the name of a dance group organized by community leader Guadalupe Barba that participates every year. In one photograph here, two girls pray in front of the Virgin, an image that mirrors the adoration of Juan Diego to the Holy Mother in 1531. The 16th century origin story involves mostly men, Juan Diego and the Bishop of Puebla, Juan de Zumárraga, for example. By contrast, this celebration at St. Benedict's Church involves more than 40 women and a few men. More typical of the event is the image here, with shows a young woman shortly before dancing. Absent from these photos are the countless hours spent making the dresses, organizing rehearsals, and cooking the food. Without the participation of these women, the celebration of the Virgin would not be the same. Other transnational practices and cultural traditions that are portrayed in my photos involved food like chayos, Mexican tamales, and the incorporation of piñatas in several parties. The piñata's historical roots tie with Chinese, Spanish, Italian, and Mesoamerican indigenous traditions, specifically Mayan and Aztec. The barber shop, like Dominican's Francisco Peña's New York style in Lebanon, is a space for socialization and cultural affirmation for Latinos in the diaspora. It provides a source of pride and dignity about their physical appearance that questions stereotypical images that otherwise abound. This one is also an example of the entrepreneurship of the Dominican community in the United States. This cuatro is courtesy of the family of Ivor Tirado of San Juan, Puerto Rico, and we want to thank Dr. Noralis Ruiz for lending us this beautiful instrument. It is a 10-string lute, typically used to perform the island's folk music or jíbaro tradition. The instrument has played an integral role in shaping the cultural identity, where it is regarded as the national instrument. This model represents the modern cuatro that flourished in Puerto Rico in the 1920s, and it characterized by its violin shape. The 10 metal strings are arranged in 5 pairs, and each pair is tuned in intervals of fourths. In a music ensemble, the cuatro is played with a pick or plectrum, and its melodic role is usually accompanied by a guitar, guiro, and bongos. Currently, with more Puerto Ricans living in the United States than on the island, the Puerto Rican population stateside keeps creating, innovating, and showcasing the cuatro in major events and festivals, some of which attract cuatro music enthusiasts from Puerto Rico and the United States. From the first waves of Puerto Rican migration early in the 20th century, the cuatro has evolved, developed, and transformed in the hands of cuatro players away from the island. The first commercial recordings featuring the instrument were performed and produced in New York City. The cuatro has expanded its role beyond jíbaro music and nowadays is used in classical and popular music.
These 4 photographs were taken by Rolf Ross, who's an artist that works up in northeastern Pennsylvania, who was introduced to me by a good friend of mine, Drake Gomez, who works at Keystone College. And so they explore some themes that the rest of the exhibit is also looking at. So we were very, very pleased he allowed us to use them. Rolf Ross's images show both the poignancy, that the centrality of family, and that's why people are doing this incredibly hard work. Here you see agricultural workers doing the same kinds of labor, lifting buckets of produce into the back of a truck, and how physically demanding it is, how arguably degrading the environment is, how difficult it is to maintain a sense of dignity and respect, and then how people reassert that dignity through ritual, through often around food. So I think there's a lot of continuity between the work that he did and our work.
At Christmas time, Puerto Ricans celebrate trullas where the typical cuatro can be heard. In this picture, Mexican and other Latinos from Lebanon celebrate the posadas, which is Spanish for lodging or accommodation, a similar tradition inspired by the migrant condition. Just as Mary and Joseph looked for shelter, in the posadas, people sing from house to house to commemorate that event. We want to thank Rolf Ross for lending us his work and acknowledge Frank Espada's huge contribution to this history. We also need to thank graphic artist Fernando Rompedrique, who designed most of our posters. He did an amazing job, as you saw. Iraida Cacique, she knows why, Guadalupe Barba, Maribel Gonzalez, Jorge Duani, and all the people who agreed to have their picture taken. Thank you.
These images were done by the great Puerto Rican photographer Frank Espada, who was part of his diaspora project in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I love this photograph because it's a couple, one of whom is from Pennsylvania, one of whom is from Puerto Rico, and they're in the context of Chester County as mushroom workers. So most of these images are from Chester County. Here you see the kind of, again, the enduring themes of how difficult the work is, how there's a kind of demand to do it. This is from Harrisburg, the kind of other side of the state from Chester County, and you see the really kind of squalid conditions that Puerto Ricans found themselves in. This image is of a Puerto Rican worker being evicted from his company housing in Chester County. We would like to thank all the institutions and people who helped us with this project, beginning with the Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society, Joel Knifesiger, Dr. Rolando Santiago, Becca Carpenter, Dr. Barbara McNulty, the Suzanne Arnold Art Gallery at Lebanon Valley College, also the LVC Innovation Fund, the Dick Joyce Fund of the History Department, the Serby Fund of the Languages Department, and everybody who agreed to be interviewed for us and all the ideas we got from them. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. All right. Well, thank you very much. So, Dr. Hinshaw, Dr. Guzmán, do you have anything else that you would like to add to that? We don't seem to have any questions. Oh, wait, yes, we do. I'm sorry.
Where was the
Okay.
exhibit hosted? That's at Street Road Artist Space, which is in Chester County. And I will send Christine actually, hang on. Christine, maybe you could post the exhibit. It was last year, so it'd be under their 2020 exhibit, but there's this video, there's an interview and a kind of longer talk that we gave with questions and answers. That was really nice. And then the last was an exhibit and recording a musical performance of the Quattro. So there's 3 different videos that are there, and those are going to be up on that website. Oh, they'll stay up on that website
Okay.
indefinitely.
So we have a question from Catherine Stouch. What are the employment opportunities that bring the population to York?
I would say it's just, I mean, often when you hear people who say, how did you come here? They tend not to say they got hired at a specific place, but they mostly say, oh, my aunt told me to come. Because my aunt has, we're staying in a 1-bedroom or a studio place in the Bronx. And then she says, hey, I have a 2-bedroom place and I have a backyard and you should come here. And then, you get hired in a warehouse or a chicken processing plant. That would be Lebanon County. But it's basically wherever the working poor can get employment. And so, that's where people end up.
We have a question over on Facebook from Terry Reichard, and I apologize if I didn't say that last name properly. Were there Latinx units in World War I or World War II as there were African American units?
Ivette, do you want to?
I'm sorry, I
Were
was
there-
not paying attention.
There's a book, I think it's called The Soldiers of the Nation, by our friend Frankie.
Frank Espada.
No,
Harry Frankie.
Harry Frankie. I'm sorry, I got his name jumbled up. But there were Puerto Ricans who served in Panama, was pretty important, and throughout the Caribbean before World War I. There's an argument about whether or not Puerto Ricans were granted citizenship in 1917 so that they could fight in World War I, although it's ambiguous. That's certainly quite plausible. But then by World War II, there was the Boricuaners who fought there and in Korea. And indeed, I want to say last week or the week before, there's going to be a national day of appreciation for that unit. They took really heavy casualties in Korea, for instance.
It's known as the 65 de Infanteria. If there's any Puerto Ricans there, they will remember. It's also a very important highway named after them in the island. So the Borinqueniers son el 65 de Infanteria. So, but Puerto Ricans have been in any war that the United States decides to jump in, and some of the first ones deployed are Puerto Ricans. Our expertise is not in that area, but it's definitely out there.
And it's a bit like African Americans. There's a very strong tradition of participation in the armed forces, and in part because it's a way to get deployed throughout the country, to get opportunities for education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that still goes on down to the day. And then I see the question from Nancy Hess about what's the relationship between Puerto Ricans and other Latino groups. It's hard to overgeneralize. There is one big difference, is that Puerto Ricans, because of their relationship to the United States as a territory or colony, depending on how you want to say it, they are US citizens from birth. So all of the other kind of immigration questions are not relevant to Puerto Ricans. So you sometimes get that can sometimes come up in a kind of negative way. But oftentimes people will, like when I live abroad, I will talk to people that in the United States I wouldn't talk to, mainly because I wouldn't have opportunity to talk to them. So when you're an expatriate, which is, if you live abroad and you meet somebody who's an American, who's a pediatrician or from a different political party or, a different race, you're like, oh, it doesn't matter, right? Because we're all in this together. We have so much more in common together. And so you see both of those things kind of going on simultaneously. There's sometimes there are people who will look down on other groups because we're citizens and you're not, and others will say, yeah, but we work and you don't. And then there's other ways, and we try to get at that through the St. Benedict, the church, where you see, so for instance, the Virgin of Guadalupe, it's not a holiday in Puerto Rico. It's just not anything that any Catholic would celebrate. But if you're here and or a big part of the church is Mexican, of course you participate, of course you play. So and then there's the cuatro we played in the Virgin of Guadalupe musical performance, where that would never be played in Mexico. So, and that's part of what we think is interesting, is that as time goes on, as people get together, culture changes. People borrow ideas or practices from each other that they like.
Do the Mennonite Puerto Ricans, do they still take part in the Lady of Guadalupe celebrations as sort of a cultural, connection? Or
that would be different. So the first Spanish-speaking church in Lebanon was a Mennonite church, and that's a whole other piece of the exhibit. And it's very interesting. But they would be in a separate church. They're sort of not part of the other tradition because that's Catholic. There still are, I want to say, about a dozen Spanish churches throughout Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And what's funny, and it sort of shows not funny, but they're not huge, but there's a few hundred. And in some cases, you have people who are second generation or sometimes third generation who are in a Spanish language church, but then they don't speak Spanish. So the services are also becoming in Spanish and in English. So that's a whole very interesting piece. And that's, I think, where people can do, that's the positive part of this as a scholar, is that there's always more things to kind of study and research and explore.
Yeah, it was just kind of wondering, because I know a lot of people, this is sort of a generalization, but I know people that participate in religious practices, more of it's just, what their family's always done. It's more of a cultural thing rather than a religious thing. So I was just wondering if they kind of still, took part in the more, I guess, celebratory part of the event rather than the religious part. I don't see any other questions. I don't think we have any. No more over at Facebook.
Awesome.
So I think we'll wrap it up. And I thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who has participated and your patience with my struggling through the technology portions. But thank you, Dr. Hinshaw and Dr. Guzmán, and have a wonderful day.
Yeah.
Thank
See
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.